Well, Chetan, I'm extremely curious how your readings of Deleuze and thinking on Deleuze has been going because my brain got sucked into a massive fall into a Deleuze pit yesterday for about 11 hours. I'm curious, like what have you? I'm curious your thinking on him these days. How has that been going? Because I'm trying to get kind of a hold a lot on the conclusion of difference and repetition, where he talks about thinking difference as thinking groundlessness. But what does that look like without a dialectic that can then be like the destabilization of being and nothing into becoming? So is it something where like Deleuze claims he doesn't use the dialectic and uses the dialectic? I'm really curious, or any of your thoughts on Deleuze lately?
So I'm reading this book by Deleuze, Nietzsche and Philosophy these days, actually. So see, one of the things I think we get stuck with Deleuze is that we try and find, and I sort of trying to think through writing about it also, that we try and see how the concepts of Deleuze and Hegel match or don't match. So, and we get stuck into that kind of a thinking where we're thinking that conceptually you can find relationship between them. You may think they are unrelated. And at all points of time, I think any of these concepts can be translated back into each other also. You can always find a way to translate it. And I think Deleuze is very aware of that. I don't think Deleuze's critique of Hegel is simply this, that, that what I'm saying cannot be said dialectically also. In fact, he would say that is exactly the problem. That when you put those questions dialectically, you lose something over there. That is the kind of thinking that Deleuze have in that sense. And then we have to ask the question that why is Deleuze reacting to dialectics in the way that he's reacting to in the sense, while being aware of the fact that what he's saying can be said dialectically also.
Right.
That's the kind of question we need to ask, I think, when we are reading something of that nature. And then we have to see whether that claim holds up and to what degree does that claim hold up. What comes out from this detour into Deleuze from Hegel, and then we're coming back to Zizek over there, because Zizek actually, to my reading of Zizek at least, is that Zizek affirms a lot of the conclusions of Deleuze.
Yeah.
He is not somebody who's completely ignoring the Deleuzean turn in Hegel. In fact, a lot of Zizek actually completely goes to the end of Deleuze and comes back to Hegel in that sense. So what is that turn all about? And that question, I think, is much bigger than simply trying to see whether concepts can be matched up or not. Concepts can always be matched up. I don't think that's the challenge. The challenge is to see what Deleuze was seeing in Hegel as the problem, and at what level did does that critique hold or doesn't hold? If it doesn't hold, how do we rethink it today? Those kind of questions, I think, are So, for instance, when Deleuze says that dialectics is a reactive thinking,
right?
It emerges from what Deleuze would call will to nothingness. Taking Nietzsche from there in that sense, or he would say that in different repetition, his argument would be that the difference is primary to negation.
Right.
That's his real problem in dialectics. That in dialectics, negation becomes primary.
Right.
How do we what is at stake in this relationship in difference and negation? Then there is some stake at what you make it primary in the Deleuzean thinking. Personally, I don't agree with Deleuze. My issue with Hegel would be very different. I don't agree with at that point with Deleuze, but I do think Deleuze is important to read Hegel today. I don't think Hegel can be read without actually going through the Deleuzean, which is why I read Deleuze.
No, it's funny you say that. A few things. It almost feels like it's not possible to understand Hegel except through the other thinker I've been doing is Derrida and Deleuze and thinking about them. And really, there is so much about what Derrida is doing in deconstruction, which is the location of the fact that a concept cannot stabilize itself. Well, that's exactly Hegel, right? He would just call that the following of the dialectic, or you're following the fact that a thing, as it tries to ground itself, negates itself, but that leads to a sublation. Whereas perhaps the difference is in Derrida, when you find the otherness of a concept, that's the grounds to deconstruct it to make a clearing for something else, right? Now, those absolutely can overlap. And I think it is very difficult to really understand It's just very interesting that Derrida actually almost makes it easier to understand what Hegel is doing, right? And I don't think that's just simply a projection onto Hegel, because you kind of follow the thought better in the science of logic. Well, the same, I think, goes with Deleuze. Like understanding Hegel with the metaphysics and ontology of Deleuze in mind really, really helps bring it out. And certainly Deleuze can be fit into Hegel. What I wonder, so for me, I think you put it very, very well, where for Deleuze, it would seem as if like difference is primary or most fundamental, and that negation is kind of a threat to difference in a way, right? Because you're kind of negating difference, and that would mean you can relate enough to difference in order to negate it. And what I'm really interested with, and this is a very open question, I'm very curious about relations in Deleuze, because relations seem very interesting. So we know that in difference and repetition, he's concerned about representation, right? And he talks about, analogy, resemblance, opposition, and there's a fourth one that escapes me, as epistemologies of representation that threaten difference, right? Okay, so is relation for Deleuze, and this is where I'm not, and I'm curious what you think about this, a very open question. So we know he likes Whitehead, we know he likes Bergson. Well, we know relation in those are ontological, right? Are relations ontological in Deleuze, or are relations merely epistemological? Whereas in like Hegel, like relations are onto-epistemological, right? They're kind of deeper. But that all comes out of the primacy of the negation. See, what it seems to me that perhaps some of the difference is, but I'm not sure, and I've been told that the logic of sense is critical for these kind of questions on Deleuze, but I'm not sure. Is it something where in Deleuze, you cannot have a relation, because a relation would suggest that there's enough resemblance between difference to kind of threaten the difference, because you can relate to it, right? And so there has to be a de-emphasis on relation in order to bring out difference. But if you do that, well, then you can't really have dialectic or negation, because that would require, or it can't be primary, because there would have to be enough relation by which to determine that there's a failure for the thing to complete itself or to be a self-relating negativity, right? It would just be a difference of which is observed by thought, but it cannot be fully comprehended by thought. So there's almost like, instead of relation, I think Deleuze talks about overlap. You can kind of have an overlap of concepts, and they can relate without almost touching in a way. But the moment they touch, there's like a threat of a violation of difference, precisely because there's enough resemblance for them to touch. And that seems to maybe be some of the grounds. Now, in one way, a de-emphasis on relation, if I'm understanding that correctly, and I do not claim I am, is good, because difference is kind of protected, right? There's a kind of honoring of difference, and then thought is making space for difference as opposed to violating difference or trying to reduce difference to resemblance. But in another way, there's a danger there, because without relation, it's hard to have resemblance, and without resemblance, it's hard to have intelligibility. And it kind of makes me think of the debates between like the cathatic and apathetic, stuff in theology, where in the apathetic tradition, you really want to emphasize the fact that your concept of God isn't God, because that's a violation of God's being. Likewise, in Deleuze, it's like, yeah, we want to really emphasize that concepts are not actually relating to the difference, only pointing to the difference, because that would be a kind of violation of the difference. Now, I just said a whole lot. All of that might be entirely wrong, and you are more than free to say they're wrong, but I'm extremely interested in relation in Deleuze, because it seems to have something to do with why negation is problematic. But I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that, Chetan? Respond any way whatsoever you like.
To be honest, I would have to go back and read Deleuze to really know where you're coming from on it, because offhand, I'm not sure I would have a good enough response to it, because I haven't thought it from the way you're thinking about it. It's very interesting. What I can say immediately without committing either way onto it is, see, in Deleuze, you have, say, how Stephen Holgood would put it, that you have this virtual world in Deleuze. Yeah, which is different from the way it's in Hegel. It's the Hegel, the contradiction becomes itself, the primary thing in that sense. In Deleuze, it doesn't, precisely because there is a virtual space over there.
Right.
So when you have a virtual space in that sense, I'm not sure Deleuze would simply agree with the statement that he's de-emphasizing relation. Then relations become different. So in some senses, in some senses, Kant is getting repeated in Deleuze into that degree. Kant's transcendental becomes Deleuze virtual. If you see that relationship, that in trying to go away from Hegel, you bring back some part of which is whereby I think me and my brother were having discussion last week. I'm not sure I'm right because I've not read Derrida to any real degree, but discussion was something of this nature that Derrida wants to hold this transition from Kant to Hegel while also arguing for, in some senses, Deleuze's difference.
Yeah.
That he wants to not get back to negation. He wants the meaning to get, deferred in that sense. And this movement from away from the center, while Hegel, Deleuze actually plays a reverse game. He wants difference to remain primary and he wants to affirm the difference and so on and so forth. But he's okay with the virtual world, the virtuality of that situation, concepts having the genetic origin and so on and so forth. It is in that context and the nature of relation would change. I'm not saying it's a de-emphasis of religion if you think at from the Hegelian perspective. If the Hegelian is looking at it, he would look at it from that sense. And you're right to that degree. But if you're Deleuzean might not agree with you. His argument from the side would be that it's not a de-emphasis. You're looking at it the wrong way. It is a rethinking of relation because a virtual space which needs to be thought through hasn't been thought through in Hegel.
Right.
And now relations have to be formed differently than they were being formed before. And I think that struggle would, go on. And if you go either side too much, I think you emerge from their own contradictions. If you take this virtual thing too seriously, you go back to Kant each time. And each time the same contradiction emerges, which Hegel keeps on pointing out, that a contradiction lies in the thing itself.
Right.
They're not thinking the thing. And vice versa, if you go too much on the Hegelian side, then Deleuze's problem emerges that dialectic becomes too representational.
Yes.
It becomes something which falls into the trap of representation. It is not able to, given these 2 points of thinking, now what is the way forward? I think one way forward is to think through Hegel through Lacan. That is one trajectory. Therefore, Lacan is close to Deleuze also, and he's close to Hegel also. That is one way out, say, Jupanchik, Zizek have taken. There are other ways also. One of the philosophers I'm reading these days is Bernard Stiegler, whose critique of Hegel is very different. So he's critiquing Hegel upon this problem that in Hegel dialectics, things get exteriorized very fast. Speed is the problem in Hegel for him. Things are too fast in Hegel. And you have to think through that Hegelian question for him through speed and entropy rather than through, simply this question of representation. And for him, representation becomes a problem precisely because the speed is an issue. So how do we think through these kind of gaps? That's my sense of it. I'm not sure as you have to go back.
I think that's a tremendous. I think that's a good way to think it. Definitely, the virtual seems very important in Deleuze, and I understand the virtual now. Again, Deleuze is always someone that you read and then you read and you're like, wait, maybe I'm not. The virtual seems to be almost like an actualized potential, right? It's like a potential that is actually part of actuality, as opposed to a potentiality or a creativity. There's kind of that Bergson and creative evolution, like a potential that is a pure abstraction. And I think kind of putting relation in the realm of the unfolding of the virtual seems to be correct. And I think, for me, when I talk about relation, whereas like there's relation that is it's not virtual in Hegel, like or it is actually like ontological, like things are relations. Whereas in Deleuze, it would seem as if things are difference, of which then creatively unfold, if I'm looking for a phrase, relative to virtual relations. That's whereas in Hegel, it's that things are in of themselves a kind of instability, a kind of contradiction, and that contradiction leads to change, and like in a dialectical fashion. So in Deleuze, because I'm thinking this through, and this is all live, and I always hesitate to even talk about thinkers like this because it might be so wrong, but one goes through. Where in Deleuze, you have the essential difference, as the phrase I like to say, of which then creatively unfolds relative to the virtual potential. But he seems to, in the conclusion of difference and repetition, talk about that difference like the Bergson totality, where in Bergson, time is a whole, right? And that the unfolding of time is more holographic. It's not really that, time moves from past into present into future. You have a totality of which then can relate to other totalities in their own kind of, I guess he talks about duration, that may not be right. These different totalities that then virtually relate, but that potentiality does not change the difference itself, because the difference is kind of total, right? Although it has to creatively unfold and realize itself. So so then a thing can kind of relate to itself, but kind of virtually, because it's always relating to the whole, but the implications of that have to unfold through time or the repetition, right? Because as I understand Deleuze, the repetition brings out the difference, because when things repeat, they precisely don't repeat the same way, but in a repetition, they look the same, so the difference is not there, and yet it has to be there for the repetition to occur. So the difference is always kind of lacking in a sense, right? The difference is not there, but the very fact that there is a repetition is evidence that the difference is in essence not merely an illusion or something, not something there. So the very occurring of repetition is of itself evidence of that difference, of which is always left out of the repetition, but what makes the repetition possible, right? Well, that's a virtual. That sounds much more virtual. Whereas in Hegel, the dialectic unfolds because things in themselves have an instability. So the relation is then, dare I say, the relation of the contradiction to itself in the true infinity, that then in that instability is constantly undergoing negation, sublation, negation, sublation, negation, sublation, which would then make relations, of which would make possible contradiction as such, ontological, and in the very being of things. And that seems to be the difference, but what's funny about that is that would mean in Hegel, the difference, it's more like contradiction is essential, and by contradiction, not logical contradiction, but the fact that a concept always cannot, it's AB, not AA, where in Deleuze, difference is essential, of which then in of itself, in the repetition of that difference, has a creative unfolding in terms of virtuality. What do we think of that? I just said a lot again, but I'm to try to kind of parse them. And obviously, too, there is something in Hegel that makes difference essential. There actually is a kind of difference that is essential to Hegel, but that difference in its difference negates into sublation. Wherein in Deleuze, that difference then is realized in its totality through the virtual, through kind of the virtual unfolding. And that there's kind of a difference in the unfolding, it seems. Any thoughts? Again, I'm throwing out thoughts, but I'm trying to relate where in difference and repetition, he brings in Bergson and he talks about difference as if it's that Bergson totality. I really wish, I don't know if there's a book, I'd be curious where he really talks about Whitehead, because he mentions in the conclusion that, Whitehead is one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century and doesn't say anything else. Well, in Whitehead, relations are ontological, right? I mean, relations are very ontological because that is what makes possible events. Right? And things are events. So I don't know, I threw out a lot at you, and I appreciate you joining me for this kind of thinking through and exploring different avenues to these thinkers.
No, what you said is fantastic. In fact, it helps me think through a lot of things. In fact, I Whitehead is one thinker that I've kept for myself, but I haven't really gone through him in that sense. It's one of my to-do lists, which I haven't, But to think alongside you, whether I don't think there would be good answers to these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. In many ways, repetition also sort of repeats, in the Deleuze thinking. It is a condition through which difference gets, repeated. Other way to think through this problem of the virtual, and as I said, just alongside you, would be that when you think of Lacan's real. Real in Lacan is a fiction through which this movement takes place. Real. That's why the real and Hegel's contradiction can be mapped upon. In Hegel also, it's a problem of the real only. The virtual is a problem of the real in many senses. It's a real in the sense that here the real becomes the ideal. Ideal which never gets completely realized, but it never gets completely, but you always need that ideal to in some sense find a repetition in that sense and a movement through that difference, and that kind of a thinking can be actualized over here. On the question of relation, as I said, when you start thinking through this question of non-relation, say in Lacan, that in Lacan also what you get a certain emphasis on relation precisely through emphasizing relation in some senses, that this non-relation is the condition for forming all relations. Because if there is an ontological relation, and I'm sure Whitehead would agree to that if Whitehead had known that in some senses. I'm not sure, I've not read Whitehead a lot, but I think Whitehead would agree to that if we simply have an ontological relation in a very direct sense, then the whole condition for knowledge would change. We are not having the same discussion. The discussion is possible precisely because relations are formed on this fundamental non-relation underneath it. That's true even in Hegel. That is what Deleuze is also actualizing in many senses. When he's saying difference, he's trying to say non-relation is important.
Yes.
And it is true that non-relation difference sort of gets actualized in Deleuze also. So to that degree, I think we can always find these frameworks to work with each other also.
Yes.
In that sense. I think what is at stake is that why does Deleuze feel that dialectics always slips back into representation?
Yes.
What is at stake in saying that if negation becomes primary, then you cannot escape this cycle of representation, power, living to nothingness. These are words. Reactive forces. These are words that he would use to,
So Dimitri, we're having a debate trying to figure out the difference and technical distinctions between Deleuze and Hegel, because I fell down a rabbit hole yesterday for like 11 hours going through all of Deleuze, difference and repetition, because I was like, I want to understand the difference. I want to get this. And it was stupid. I actually literally at one point was like in the garage, lights off. I took difference and repetition, threw it across the room. It's like, I don't understand. So we were going through this and I'm trying to understand and what I was bringing up. So Chetan and I were having a spiritual connection because he was going through Deleuze as well. And so for me, a lot of it kind of is like, what is relation in Deleuze? Like, is Deleuze like relation ontological? And Chetan's making the tremendous point that it's virtual, and then what is virtual? And it seems like there is a difference, like where Hegel's going to make negation very fundamental and Deleuze is going to make difference fundamental. And how does that transform the philosophy? And why? I think you just asked a really big question. Why does Deleuze seem to think that dialectics leads back to identity? Because he kind of says that. He says somewhere in Difference and Repetition, maybe in the conclusion, where he says that Hegel pushed contradiction to the logical point and then fell back into representationalism. And that's how he seems to think about Hegel. Of course, the argument would be that's not true, or that's not the case, but why does Deleuze think that way? And also, we were making the point where there are differences between Deleuze and Hegel, but I've just been fascinated because I was also going through on grammatology and all of Derrida because I'm an idiot, and found all of, like, it's like you almost have to think Deleuze and Derrida to think Hegel today, right? So this is not a like either or, one's worse than the other. There is some really important overlap here. So a few things. One, it definitely seems in Deleuze that relations are like no relations, but those are a kind of relation, right? And so in the same way that when I don't relate to someone, Mr. Luber, good to see you. So when I don't relate to someone, there is a kind of relation in that not relating, of which then conditions me. Right. And relations are kind of non-relation. In the way I was trying to think through it, just because I think the theological kind of metaphor is useful. If you believe in the apophatic tradition where God is unthinkable, then what are you doing when you think of God? Right? There's a sense in which you're not thinking of God when you think of God in the apophatic, right? Like God is not God. So there's a way in which for Deleuze, whenever there's a thought that by definition is going to have a representative character, you're always non-representing not representing in Deleuze, but it's a kind of non-representation in Deleuze. And there's a non-analogous to Deleuze. And it's kind of like, it reminds me of this debate, this ancient debate between purely negative theology and what's called kapithatic theology, which is the notion that our ideas of God have something to do with what God is like. And then this idea that our ideas of God don't have something. Well, the risk of an apophatic tradition is then what are we talking about? Like, what are you even doing, right? Like, if your concepts of God have absolutely nothing to do with God, well, then you're not talking about God at all, right? There's no substance to the theology. And also what can end up happening is then, like, it's just kind of infinite. It can become anything, right? There's no boundaries, there's no definitions. But of course, the danger of the kapithatic is that you say, oh, we relate to God. Well, then we must be God to be able to relate to God. And then you have a kind of power structure, right? So then the giant debate with like theology was trying to find a middle, basically, between the apophatic and the kapithatic. And here is the question. For me, I guess this is where I ended up on the paper. Does Hegel's dialectic help us get a middle better than, say, if we're using this language, Deleuze's non-relation? Like, which of those actually leads to a better way to relate to beings or things in the world? The dialectic, or this kind of virtual non-relation, of which then would be a kind of honoring of essential difference, right? As opposed to a participation in the unfolding of a contradiction into the becoming of that thing, right? So which of those, it's almost like a question of which of those is a kind of thought that's almost better at honoring reality, right? Because definitely, and then I'll pass it to Dimitri, definitely Deleuze's project helps fight fascism. That's one of the main things he's doing, right? Because if you can't represent, if you can't analogy, you can't judge, well, then there's a restriction on power, right? Because power cannot like say we are all X, therefore we do Y, and that's going to fight fascism. So there's no doubt that the ontology and metaphysics of Deleuze is a way to resist power, and that's very Derridian as well. There's no doubt that the Derridian projects have very useful political ramifications. But here's the issue. Does Deleuze lead into atomization, as I've talked about, where it can be a weakening of communal relations because no relation is not able to bind people into community as effectively as a more substantive relation. But of course, if there's a substantive relation, if you grant me that term, the risk is political power, control, people feeling like they know one another and therefore they can manipulate one another. Relation brings that kind of risk. And it just reminds me of this apophatic-kapithatic debate that I've kind of framed Deleuze and Hegel. For all of the likelihood that I may be misunderstanding, it's been a way to think about it. And I really like Chetan, and let me give it to Dimitri. I think there is something to where the relation in Deleuze is a kind of no relation, which is a kind of relation or a virtual relation. That's helpful. But Dimitri, good to see you, sir. Let me give it to you.
Yeah, good to see you guys as well. And I've just been studying a bit in the Sefer, or like the Zohar, this Jewish mystical text. And, there's a very simple paradox that atheists propose when they talk about God, because, okay, if God is all good, but also completely omnipotent, why is there evil in the first place? It's also like the basic spontaneous reaction anyone would have when like seeing true suffering and being some kind of believer or unbeliever. Doesn't really matter. Like the notion of God might seem ridiculous in that moment, right? So not only the Sefer Zohar, but maybe even basically all theology is about the structure of this point. Not the fact that it's only like the paradox, of course, manifests in different ways, right? Like you have the all goodness and omnipotence, then you get more problems there as well. So I was reading, this will be relevant to the point in regards to Hegel and Deleuze. I was reading also a bit in Nietzsche's Menschliches all zu Menschliches, like his Human All Too Human. It's a book he wrote in the late 1870s. And there he basically does a strange move that I do not feel like he does in Zarathustra, which is that he rejects certain words. He says, like, these are words we shouldn't use, like a hero or whatever. He has all kinds of these words. And to me, what the whole battle between Hegel and Deleuze seem like is that, okay, in regards to Hegel first, like Hegel is neither purely apathetic nor relies purely on A equals A, right? So, one thing when I think about the apathetic nature of God is this quote by Meister Eckhart, and he said, "God is God." And how can that be if God is apathetic? It's very, extremely simple. But I think Hegel's answer, to put it in your language, is because of AB, God is God. So there's this, God can only be God through his own self-othering, right? And then it's a concrete God, actually. Well, for Deleuze, I feel, from the little I've read from him, I feel like he has more of a kind of Nietzschean tendency, that he has a certain vocabulary that he proposes, whereas with Hegel, there's this kind of, notional development to it, especially when you get to the science of logic and he really wants to build from the ground up. So I think that's something I would like to bring to the conversation, like the different vocabularies they use and the way that they use it, right? And in regards to the non-relation, well, like the relation is like a symptom of the non-relation. That's how I think I would put it. Like the fact that there is no non-relation, well, yes, that's kind of a problem. And as we want to instantiate ourselves in the world as subjects, with our different registers, symbolic, imaginary, but the way the non-relation manifests is always in an illusory appearance of the relation, right? And this appearance, the very deadlock of the relation that we can perceive by going into relationality, by going more intimate or whatever, that we like go to the edges of relationality where it breaks down and we encounter the trauma of non-relation. Like, I think this very deadlock itself is also the means whereby, is also the very solution to the problem of the non-relation. And so this is basically the point Alenka Zupancic, I believe, wants to make in her book, What is Sex? Like, this is the basic point of, and yeah, like the non-relation as traumatic, what do I mean by that? Well, Zizek has a very simple formula in his Sex and the Field Absolute, and he says the subject is trauma. Now, Alenka Zupancic, the way she explains trauma in What is Sex is that, as consciousnesses, we experience phenomena, but a trauma is actually the very breakdown of this experience, or you cannot experience trauma because it's it's in experience itself. That's what trauma is. And of course I mean, like, I guess you would say that the repetition compulsion or the death drive are means whereby, your spirit has like twisted around the fundamental negativity of the non-relation. I don't know how Deleuze actually would see something like this, and I wonder if, if Deleuze can think the importance of, Hegel has this beautiful word he uses. It's sich anders werden. It means self-othering, right? So everything is through its self-othering. It has to be. Anything determinate and concrete has to be like this. Like I just told you about God, right? Like, if there wouldn't be no AB, if God would simply be God in an abstract sense, and I just posit God is God, then there wouldn't be this kind of torsion, I guess I want to say, the torsion of the manifestation. So these are some of my ideas. I think it's a great fucking topic, by the way. It's really amazing that I stumbled into this.
Well, good. Well, we always like it's really, really fascinating to me because there seems to be stakes, right? I mean, there seems to be stakes in that the stuff matters, and it's just kind of getting the hold on it, because I would very genuinely say that there's something remarkably beautiful about the metaphysics and ontology of Deleuze. The question that I wonder is if indeed there's something about the non-relation that is primary in Deleuze. What are the social ramifications? Because that seems to be, as you start moving it to the social, how does that operate and how does that go? And that's what I'm curious about, because I think of a lot of the most pressing topics today, this is a big claim, have a lot to do with, political economy, economics, community, like the real in that Lacanian sense, right? So what metaphysical ontological structure is best for helping people deal with the real, right? Like which one works with that? And that's an open question. I definitely think that, again, to think Hegel today, one must have to consider Deleuze. So a few things. I wonder this. I'm always so we all know that in Deleuze, there's a real emphasis on being unperceivable. Like you cannot be perceived, right? Imperceptible is kind of the term, right? And we know that, we have anti-Oedipus, we have the logic of sense, and we also know that Foucault has written the introduction to anti-Oedipus, right? And Foucault seems to see what Deleuze is doing as potentially helping fight essentialism, or the identification of people's essence in a manner that can control them, right? And Deleuze seems to want to have thought itself resist the temptation to represent, okay? Because there's something about thinking that seems to be what keeps us from the honoring, the incubation, the unfolding of this central difference, okay? And for him, that kind of thought is going to be something that's much more associational, like James Joyce, he'll reference Joyce, where thought is following its own motion through a kind of associational logic. I think he talks about Faulkner. We know he does a lot of literature, and you see stream of consciousness. And somehow stream of consciousness is not, in fact, a failure of thought, but some sort of actual alignment with how thought is best to honor essential difference, right? Now, of course, a risk of this is that it can be difficult to understand, but there's something about that very imperceptibility that kind of helps defend and keep the essential difference in Deleuze from falling into representationalism, right? Mr. Javier Rivera, good to see you. You stumbled into a discussion where we're trying to figure out differences between Deleuze and Hegel, and at some point there will be a lobster. Just wait, there will be a lobster. And Mr. Javier announced he's going to be writing a book. Javier, writing a book. Good man. I will no doubt be sure to read it and tell the entire internet that it is wonderful. And so worry not, you will get support. Now that I've told you I'm going to do that, though, before reading it, you can wonder if it's meaningless because you might be just doing that as a friend. So now I'm going to intentionally tell the internet that it sucks so that you know that it's an honest review, okay? But now that I told you ahead of time that I'm going to tell you it sucks without reading it, whatever I say won't bother you. So I'm not going to review it. I'm just going to let it stand in its essential difference and creatively express itself to the internet. I'm so glad we could talk about it. Anyway, so in Deleuze, there seems to be a concern about a way of thinking that falls into representatism, right? And what's interesting is I wonder if Deleuze, it's almost as if even the language of other is problematic. Because if I say that like Daniel creatively unfolds into a different Daniel or something, it's not really so much that Daniel is now other, it's that there's a kind of becoming of something else that then it's in its own difference stands out. Where in Hegel would be like, no, there's an othering. Because you and your thought is relating to what you were that you no longer are. Where Deleuze is like, no, you have to resist the temptation to compare or to oppose who you were with who you are now, because that's to treat the relation as ontological as opposed to a non-relation. And really what we need to do is to say that what you are now is different. And we can't relate it back to what you were because that's actually reductionist, right? So I wonder what's interesting in Deleuze is it's almost like difference is so essential that there's not otherness. I wonder. Like there's not otherness in Deleuze because difference is so essential, right? Which then one has to act. Then it's kind of funny because then is there becoming in Deleuze? So can you only have becoming if you have negation? Like, must you have negation to have becoming, right? And if you can't have negation in Deleuze because there's an essential difference that has to be expressed, then you don't really have becoming, right? And this might be then why Deleuze seems to be, now again, all of this is just thinking, this can entirely be wrong. all of this might suggest why Deleuze seems to be very anti-psychoanalytic. You know, he doesn't like the psychoanalytical tradition. He's kind of like an anti-evidence critiquing, because it's like the moment you're like talking about trauma or dealing with change, it's like, no, you're treating yourself in light of your previous self when now you're a different expression of an essential difference. And so you're trying to reconcile yourself in your becoming and change, of which for Deleuze is problematic because there's a reconciliation as opposed to an acceptance of an expression of a new essential difference. So I wonder if parts of those come together, which then would suggest that what is at stake with the dialectic is coming to terms with our own alienness. Like in Deleuze, you don't really have to come to terms with your alienness, right? You just express your essential difference. Where in Hegel, there is something essentially alien about you that is alien precisely because of the fact that you do other yourself and you relate in your, and thought follows that otheringness and develops according to that otherness in the dialectic, and then speculatively reasons what that may mean and what that may entail. So maybe there's something there. I'm not sure. Let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Dimitri. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. And I did want to note, I do wonder if a story epistemology might be between the apophatic and the kapathatic, the negative and the positive, because there's something about letting a story unfold that seems to be a kind of following of the development where there's something beyond thought, but there's also something that can be following. So I do think that the analogy of being that Aquinas talks about is actually a kind of story epistemology, but I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. It's a thought that I had. Good to see you again. I've gotten to see Mr. Luber 3 times this week. It's a good week.
Yeah, that's where my mind went. Also, I like your explanation with what you were saying with Hegel and just the alien and the other. I think that's also, to me, very like story unfolding language. I really have a question. Negation and difference. To me, when I think of negation, I think of it in terms of difference. So I don't know if that's just like a logical misstep in my thinking, or if there's some like validness to that. Like the few things I read about Deleuze made me think that negation is difference, in the sense that, like, if you just, like, in school when I would learn about logic, like when I would negate a symbol, like that symbol could represent like anything, let's say like a tree. But if I'm talking about a particular thing about the tree, like if it's an oak tree versus an apple tree, like that to me is a negation, like, and based off that difference, even though like it's still about the tree, the sentiment of the variable is addressing the type of tree, and that's what the negation is therefore addressing. So that was how I understood it. I just kind of wanted to ask that question, and yeah.
Very, very fair. I think that's an excellent question. A few things. One, when I say there is no other in Deleuze, it would be like to say that there's non-other in Deleuze, right? I just have that, and everything he's doing is for the sake of defending the minority or protecting people. But it's this notion of the same subject becoming other, as Hegel talks about. That's what I'm wondering if we can't have in Deleuze, where there's not any becoming other. There's only an expression of difference, of which then is a new difference and a new difference. And it's only your mind trying to compare or connect them together that makes you fail to honor the new essential difference or the new creative unfolding of that essential difference. Therefore, anti-edifice, the logic of sense and different things. But to your question, so absolutely, this is what's so weird, is that Deleuze and Hegel are insanely similar. There's some insane similarity and yet significant differences. And then we all just kind of dance around a fire and, eat hot dogs. But you see, it would seem like so for Hegel, the negativity is the fact that when a thing tries to relate to itself, it finds itself inevitably having to negate the way that it relates to itself and sublate into something else. So for the way I put it is that negativity and sublation in Hegel are always tied together, right? But it is a result of a thing trying to be itself. So a simple way to kind of put it is you can talk about the parts whole debate, right? The moment I try to say, what is the bookcase? We talked about this the other night, the AB logic, is that you end up inevitably really struggling to locate what essentially makes a bookcase, right? And yet there is a point where the parts actually come together to do something that's almost more real. Like it's almost like the whole is realer than the parts. Often we say the parts are realer than the whole, but it's almost the reverse of that. And in that negation of the parts, it's not that the parts say vanish into thin air, but you start to see that they are not merely the parts. The negation brings out something else that's sublated, right? So a negation is not merely a moving away, it's a transformation of the previous understanding into a different understanding. So the negation sublates, right? The parts of the book say, okay, the parts of the bookshelf at a certain point negate just being random parts like handle, wood, shelves, books. They're all just kind of parts. And then suddenly those kind of isolated identities, boom, become a whole. Right. So that's one way to think of it. In the same way that there's a certain point where the definition of freedom only maintains freedom if it starts incorporating justice. Because if you're free and people are just killing one another, well, that doesn't really feel like freedom anymore, right? So there's a point where freedom has to kind of negate itself as an autonomous concept and start incorporating other concepts in order to maintain itself. So there's a becoming other in it, right? So that would be a kind of negation. What I would be saying is that in Deleuze, it's not really that a concept, it's not really that a thing in of itself eventually arrives at a negation of itself, is that things are an essential difference that is always total, like in a Bergson sense, that gradually unfold the meaning of that totality in a virtual space. Now, that was an entire ton of crazy terms and different things, but that would be kind of the difference. And it would almost be like for Deleuze, what he seems to think is that the dialectic inevitably falls back into some sort of representationalism, which for him is bad because then there's power that can control it, that can comprehend it, that can take advantage of it, and so on and so on. So those would be some stabs I took at your question.
Can I just comment real quick, and then
Please.
Whoever's next can jump in? So like the story ontology, then to me, based off just like what you're saying and how at least I understand the story ontology, is just that the negation is taking part in at least in a twofold way, where the negation has a meaning in the story dimension, and then also has its own meaning in the thematic dimension. So like to go back to like the tree, you have like the tree's the same, they're both trees, but one's an oak and one's an apple. So like basically it's recognizing that the self is the self in both cases, but it's a different self at the same time. So it's just affording like negation, in my mind, negation to have different meanings in different conceptual contexts, if that makes sense. That would be like the story ontology, at least. Sure. I think, if that makes sense. And then,
I mean, I'll comment on Dimitri, Javier, and Chetan. I think, again, if I bring in that old debate with the medievals, because it's important, Deleuze talks a lot about Duns Scotus with the univocity of being, which is a huge debate. He talks a lot about Spinoza. So he's kind of embedded in this kind of ancient metaphysics or classical medieval metaphysics. If Hegel indeed is actually more someone of the analogy of being, which would be Thomas Aquinas, that is indeed a kind of story epistemology, of analogy that's going to be following. So those things would follow. Now, I have to get into the analogy of being and why that's such a hot topic in theology, because I actually think it's a good metaphoric schema to kind of understand perhaps this difference, where Deleuze seems to be on the side of really wanting to really preserve and honor essential difference and put limits on thought and its ability to represent that essential difference for the sake of honoring that essential difference, where someone like Hegel may say, well, if you do that too much, you actually lose the ability to even honor that essential difference because the thought is too much of a non-relation. And then that might just get down to the freaking nitty gritty of how much is too much and how little is too little and degrees and different stuff. I'm not sure, but let me give it to Dimitri, Javier, and Chetan.
So going off what you guys just talked about, to me, it seems like the subjective disposition that Deleuze's metaphysical structure relies on is the form of spirit of the child, Nietzsche's child. Nietzsche says that this child is a continuous forgetting. So, of course, if you are in this, let's say, mode of becoming, of course, it would appear to you that you just express the essential difference over and over again without the history. Now, here we come to the question of concrete universality. And I think, I mean, then you can be like the devil's advocate, you know, like Hume's advocate here. But I think the fact that Hume cannot think, correct, but I think that the fact that Hume cannot think religion is because he cannot think concrete universality, because he denies universality, right? He just says, no, it's not, you can't take the universal statement, that's what's happening here. And you don't really have, you know, but for Hegel, there's something different actually going on here, you know, like you don't have to know all men to talk about the universal man in its concept having a, you know, a real movement to it that has a certain efficiency and whatever. So why is concrete universality so important in regards to, for example, religion? Is because like Alexander Bart recently, a few months ago, did a talk called a religion that is finally a religion. And like, I think the proper Hegelian answer would be that, you know, a religion that's finally a religion has to be a concrete universality, which means that it fails to be a religion, and the very way that it fails to be the true and final religion, it is religion, as being something concrete to tarry with in our world. Like, it doesn't really matter what you think of God, or, you know, of the soul, or perhaps Jesus Christ, Buddha, whoever, whatever kind of religious figure. Like, these notions will have their historical efficiency for many ages to come. So I think that's something to tarry with, right? And I think that's something that you could perhaps fall into when you go into Deleuze and rest upon this metaphysics of, you know, the essential difference, is that you just outright reject this because there's this historicity to this development that you're always already stuck in. Now, for Hegel, on the other hand, this is, of course, like, or for Nietzsche, like, you know, there's something suspicious about wanting to get out of history of the body and things like this. And I wonder, just to to see where this is going, maybe there's something to it. Like, the ontology of essential difference sees a mistake in Hegel because there's too much of a trap that one can fall into of a representation, right? But this very objectification, or like this very demonizing, this very putting like representation up to the other side and deeming, you know, it is bad, or it's not moralistic, reducible in a moralistic sense, but maybe there even is, who knows? Like, this is kind of imminent to the whole philosophy itself, right? So there is an inseparability of essential difference and representation that I think Hegel can think. Whereas I would question if Deleuze can think the inseparability of those determinations, essential difference and representation, without falling into the one-sidedness of the understanding, which would be another question. How does Deleuze actually relate to these faculties, or these faculties of the mind, or these ways of going about logic? So that's, yeah. Perhaps there's something to it.
No, it's fascinating. No, in the same way that, like, for me, ultimately, Hume has to lead to Hegel. I did that piece on it, even though Hume is invaluable, precisely because I'm afraid that Hume cannot think or provide resources for dealing with the globalized political real today. And what I mean by that can go on, and you can talk about a concrete universality. For Hume, universality has to arise out of the suchness of common life. But what are the things? Now, he will actually, funny enough, he actually defends what you could say is the theology of common experience. What he doesn't like is what he feels like is the bad theology of, like, systems building in different things. So there's a distinction there. And you basically could take Hume and say the difference between good philosophy, bad philosophy, good religion, bad philosophy, and go through all of these different things. Let me give it to Javier and Chetan. The last thing I'll say is I'm really, really, really interested by... So Deleuze seems to be aware of the problem of being incapable of thinking difference without representation. Okay, he literally brings up he calls them the knots you'd have to untie in the conclusion in order to think difference. And ultimately, what he says is that to think difference is groundlessness. Okay, is to think groundlessness, which then just sounds like thinking about God apathetically. Okay, is to think something that cannot be thought and be a non-thought in the kind of non-relation way. What's very interesting about that is I actually wonder if in the same way that like Hegel does an inversion of Kant and makes the noumenon precisely like the antinomies of reason, the failures of reason, precisely the glories of reason, it's precisely perhaps the failure of thinking to represent, of which then is a revelation of what thinking's actually in the business is, and that's not in mere representation, but speculative reason. I guess what's really weird to me is I actually wonder if Deleuze arrives in the conclusion at saying thinking needs to be in the business of speculative reason. Yes, Deleuze, that's correct. And that's where Hegel arrives at through the dialectic. But it's almost like I wonder if Deleuze arrives at like an identical conclusion by the honoring of essential difference as opposed to the following of the dialectic. I cannot help but read the conclusion and be like, you're talking a lot about speculative reason, aren't you? But then the issue is, the difference is where in Hegel's speculative reason literally might have ontological consequences with like notion and nature may overlap in insanely powerful ways. In Deleuze, the overlap would have to be a non-overlap, a non-relation. So what is the difference there? Don't know. I guess it gets into the ontological substance of virtuality. Okay, Javier. Things about quality. Go, quality.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Deleuze or Hegel, but I really see the pressing issue.
No one is. No one on planet Earth is.
I really see the pressing issue of having difference as a sort of like ontology. And I think it's like the way Andrew Luber sort of pointed it out, where it's like you kind of inevitably fall into like the victim of sameness, right? And actually stressing difference kind of creates a neurotic sameness that becomes hard to discern from the people that really want a kind of crucial ontological difference. So my work on quality has been more about how can we think difference as quality versus ontological. And I greatly question, because like the more medieval metaphysics of quality was the disposition, the nature of things. But actually, my paper argued that quality itself. So what does quality actually sort of like point towards and demand? And some of my suspicion about difference is that actually, if we think difference as quality, difference would be something more of a like an attending to. It's a sort of like a call, like a demand, right? So for example, to use Andrew Luber's example of the oak tree and the apple tree, it's not that, again, you could say that there's an ontological difference between the apple tree and the oak tree, but there's still a tree, right? But really the difference is in the quality of the attending to each tree. You have to sort of attend to the oak tree in a different manner than the apple tree because they demand specific care towards them, right? And this is how I really want to start thinking of difference, because I think difference as a sort of ontology gets kind of dangerous. And it starts getting, it gets into like that, like what you argued before with Cadell, like it gets into this like AA, CC, BB, it kind of gets this spurious infinity to it, which gets dangerous. And that's kind of like why I want to think difference more as quality, more as demand. And I think if we think of it that way, difference can be groundless in that case. Difference can have that groundless nature, but I don't think it can have groundless nature in its sort of ontology. I don't think it can. Now, Deleuze's concern about representation, I actually do think he has a good point on that. Now, the real question is his concern, is his identification about representation really the correct one? That's a different thing that I want to think through. But it does make me think perhaps we can think of representation having a kind of danger to it, which Deleuze is pointing us to, and that's something that we have to think through. We can probably think of maybe we should have representation, but with a recoil to it, I don't I don't even know what that means, but you know what I mean? Like we have like some type of wariness about it, and not just get rid of it. So there's that I would like to think through, but unfortunately I don't have enough time to think through. But yeah, that's that's it for me.
Let me give it to Chetan. Well, again, like I mean, Austin Farrer jumps between Karl Barth, who just says in the Church Dogmatics, Volume 3, that the analogy of being is the doctrine of the Antichrist, and then Thomism, which is like, nah, if you don't have the analogy of being, you can't make sense of God. And Austin Farrer tries to jump in the middle and create an epistemology that kind of bridges those, because that's basically what you're saying, is some sort of way to have representationalism that is not limiting. So representationalism can always be reductionist, and it's almost like it has to be reductionist. And that seems to be what Deleuze also says in The Logic of Sense, chapter 3, where he talks about what do we do when we take the thing we sense and put it into reason? Are we not translating phenomenon simply into a binary of true and false? And he says, is that not reductionist? And now I will note, and let me give it to you, I'm really interested in The Logic of Sense, because that seems kind of different from difference and repetition. Like he talks a lot about multiplicity versus difference. And I don't know, I do wonder if a lot of my understanding of Deleuze is based on an early Deleuze that may not be the same as the later Deleuze. And I don't know. And that's why I always hold my views of thinkers quite tentatively, because there seems to be a lot of change. But Chetan, please.
Yeah. So I wish I had done more preparation for this actually.
Or Chetan, I was like, Chetan, I've been going down to Deleuze rabbit hole. Grab them all.
Yeah. Because to talk of offhand, you have memories of these texts, but if you not read them recently, you've not done the homework, you don't have notes in front of you, it's become difficult to be sure of what you're saying. But I would like to push back a little actually on the flow we are having the discussion in that sense. And what you have to understand here is that Deleuze actually has the whole conceptual apparatus of Hegel. There is nothing in Hegel Deleuze doesn't have in his own conceptual apparatus. Let's be honest about it. So Deleuze says that what Hegel is talking about is a false movement, isn't it? It's an abstraction, which is why Deleuze is not saying that movement is not necessary. In fact, he has all the conceptual parts of that movement within itself. For instance, negation does exist in Deleuze. It happens after difference. That's it. Negation is an essential part of difference in Deleuze. Every time difference originates, a negation comes up. It's not like there is a movement from difference without negation possible. So to that degree, you will always find Hegel in Deleuze. If negation is going to happen, and to that, which is why today, if you read, say, the Panchik's What is Sex, she never pushes back Deleuze upon this question of difference and negation. There is no pushback on that question. And there's a whole section in Deleuze and Lacan over there in that book. And I was just checking it again, which is why I said, do you have some kind of homework here? But she never pushes back, because she herself puts non-relation at the heart of a Lacanian thinking of relation, which is essentially difference, which is not simple Hegelian negation as we would have thought when we read Hegel in that sense. Non is a very interesting word there. It's not like no relation or something of that nature. It's like non-violence. Non has a very interesting connotation in that sense, which is what Deleuze is arguing for in some sense. And I don't think at that level, unless you're a different kind of an Hegelian, but if you're a Hegelian coming through Lacanian path, you would not necessarily debate with Deleuze on that. In fact, everything that Hegel can think, Deleuze can think with his conceptual apparatus. That is not the problem.
Can I ask I have a really important question. Do you think the opposite is also true? Like, is there
opposite is not true actually.
That those things that Hegel cannot think?
Yeah, there are definitely. For example, when you simply ask the question like, can Hegel think complete repetition or radical repetition? Hegel can't. Let's be honest about it. Zizek himself says it, and he quotes Deleuze over there.
Wouldn't that be bad infinity?
Huh? No.
Bad infinity. No,
it wouldn't be. Radical repetition is when repetition completely takes its journey. In Hegel, something new would happen and synthesis would happen and so on and so forth. That is why I don't think that is what is at stake. What is at stake is in a discussion like this, that if we take Deleuze seriously, And we do not only sidestep in Deleuze and Foucault also, not just Hegel, but the whole German idealist movement. And to be honest, a whole philosophical turn from Aristotle to Hegel, or Plato to Hegel, does that movement have a stake in today's world or not? That is what is at stake in this discussion. What is at stake is not Deleuze can understand. Deleuze's framework is, of course, better to understand reality to that degree. But Deleuze comes after Hegel, and Zizek would become better than Deleuze. To that journey. What is at stake is that if we have to understand our reality today, does this modern philosophical turn, important to understand it, or this philosophical turn itself can be rejected? That is what is at stake. Whether we have to go back and read Hegel or not because Deleuze is better than Hegel, or Hegel is better than Deleuze, but because is Hegelian turn or Hegelian what's the word for it? There's a word for it to go through this initiation. Is Hegelian initiation important for the world forward, or that initiation can be completely let go? Deleuze, if you take seriously, and Foucault also, they're arguing to let go of that initiation. If their philosophical ideas would become dominant, this initiation would go in the background. It was no longer important. That is what they were trying to do, to read philosophy pre-Nietzsche in some senses at all. That is what would have happened. Zizek is actually pushing against that. It's not a simple push against saying that Deleuze can understand something Hegel cannot, or Hegel can understand something Deleuze cannot. There's much more bigger at stake over there. And what is that bigger is that whether we need to initiate ourselves in this long journey or not, which is that contrary to Deleuze, Zizek would say, I am a classical philosopher. I am not, and Deleuze is sort of arguing against that philosophical journey that we've had to reach the point we've reached. And I think we need to be very serious about what is at stake in the discussion. What is at stake is not simply two conceptual apparatuses trying to see which one fits better, but something else in that sense. Yeah, please go ahead.
No, that was outstanding. A few things. So this is the question. I think you're exactly right that there is a negation in Deleuze, but I do wonder if the negation is different in character. And what I mean by that is it would seem that in Deleuze, so things are essentially different. And then basically immediately they encounter negation because thought tries to comprehend it in terms of representation, or one tries to relate with other people. Now for Deleuze, that negation, this is what I wonder. Is that negation like a sublation, or is it a negation that we must learn to resist? Precisely because thought has a tendency to negate difference and resemblance, one has to think in speculative reason as opposed to representative thinking, right? In order to preserve, in a way, or to allow the totality of the essential difference in the Bergson sense to continually creative unfold, right? Of which is always already entirely present. And it doesn't really become, but it unfolds what that means. And that really weird Bergson holographic sense that things kind of time unveils, even though it's a totality. And for Bergson, in every moment of time, all of time is contained like a hologram. Okay. And I cannot help, because it seems to be what Deleuze says about difference, is that difference has the same structure, holographic structure, as time does in Deleuze. That's how I'm taking it. And indeed, I think that's how I understand it, right? So negation in Deleuze is therefore not a becoming, right? The negation is a failure to appreciate that totality that is present, that then has to be resisted, really, so it can unfold. Whereas in Hegel, the negation comes first precisely because a thing finds that it cannot that it does not entail its whole, that its whole actually does have to become through time. It is not so Bergsonian. It is a becoming, and yet it is whole and entire in that becoming, but it's much more contingent. And it's much more open. Also, I do want to note this is not a debate on if Deleuze is better than Hegel, because basically you need Deleuze to think Hegel today, right? In the same way that I think you need Hume to think Hegel. But the reason why Like I was having that conversation with Samuel Barnes, and different people have said, well, we can just stay in Hume's, right? Like I almost did. I was like, yeah, I'm ready to stay in Hume. I'm ready to stay here. But then I saw no way for Hume's doctrine of common life, which I actually think is utterly necessary for philosophy to not become a force of terror. I did not see how that could avoid basically Duginism on the global stage. It becomes that. And that's a big problem, right? So then you end up going into Hegel in the same way that Deleuze has an incredibly powerful ontology for resisting totalization, fascism, and political capture and different things, but does it lead into atomization? Because the relations are non-relations, where then you need the Hegel that I think can give you a logic of A-B, right? Now, again, like I said, the logic of sense may show that Deleuze and Hegel are more two sides of the same coin than one realizes, but it would seem as if this is what I wonder, and I'm not sure, and I'll give it to Dimitri and then Chetan and then you, is the negation in Deleuze entail sublation, or does it not? That seems to be an issue, and that would also kind of speak to the debate between the negative theology and kapithatic theology debate, which for me just helps frame this, but let me pass it on.
Well, so in Sex and the Field Absolute, Zizek says that it wouldn't, Sartre's ontology of the subject is he conceptualizes it as a self-creating void. Now, another word for this, I think, is more precise, would be self-related negativity, right? And this is how Hegel conceptualizes the subject. When you go through all the shapes of spirit in the phenomenology of spirit, you end up at the absolute knowing, where I guess the object appears to you as subject, right? Like every substance is subject in from the standpoint of absolute knowing, or so the very object, there's an object of absolute knowing, but the object is just the subject itself. Now, I think that Lacan said the only thing he ever invented was the object A, and Hegel basically cannot think the object A. I believe Zizek said this somewhere. So, what would be the status of Deleuze and the object A? And I mean, with the object A, I don't just mean the object of your desire, but also not like the object class of desire, not as a signifier, not as like the overman or whatever kind of fallacy you posit, but as like a spectral image or a voice, a gaze, those kind of phenomena. Those partial objects are actually, like, in a sense, the manifestations of the objectivity of the subject. And like the question is like, okay, perhaps Sartre is not enough here according to Zizek. Hegel also couldn't have thought this. Lacan said this was the only concept he could invent. How would Deleuze view this? What would be his position? So that's my question for you guys.
We have to understand that Deleuze is working for Guattari, and Guattari was a psychoanalyst. So and he was working in the same time, he was reading Lacan. So Deleuze's answer would be very simple, that object are actually is what would become the virtual in his system. He had this idea of the ideal in, so his answer, I think, and again, my guess is as good as yours, but for him, the whole spectrum of virtual will emerge from that gap itself, which object are, sort of occupies. And Lacan himself, found a lot of merit in what Deleuze was doing in so many senses. That is, I think, one point. I think coming back to this question of sublation, what we have to see over here is that, let's take this question of becoming. And he sort of writes very long sort of pages upon this question of becoming in Nietzschean philosophy's book. And to be honest, Deleuze's response to, say, this kind of problem would be that Hegel can't think AB. Because for Hegel, he will not be able to find a way out of representation. So for thinking AB, you have to think non-relation. That is where B would emerge, and it's true. You have to think So for Hegel, for Deleuze, he is not resisting movement. So what you are saying, if that is true, then he is trying to find difference by resisting movement. That is what your argument is. Deleuze would disagree with that. For Deleuze, movement is essential, just like in Hegel. In fact, he would say Hegel has false movement. I have the real movement. So in that sense, he's sublating in that very particular sense. He's more sublating than Hegel would, as Deleuze would look at it. For him, Deleuze is not actually sublating, or sublating itself doesn't capture the real essence of movement. Because in Hegel, you still can't get outside this problem of the negation. You still can't find movement radical enough, which is radical repetition, which is right. To that degree, Deleuze will be right about Hegel, that Hegel can't think radical repetition. If he can't think radical repetition, then he can't think radical sublation also. He can only think sublation in that sense of, synthesis, which we know today doesn't work to various degrees in that sense. So which is, again, we will come back to the same point. I think Deleuze has read his Hegel to some degree of, to the point that I don't think we can catch Deleuze simply upon this point that Hegel can do something Deleuze cannot. This kind of a thinking will put us in the same trap that Deleuze wants us to get into. He wants us to get into that trap where we start thinking in that way, what can Deleuze not do and Hegel can do? I think in that trap, we would always find Deleuze winning also to some degree, because that is how he set that debate. That is his terms of the debate in some senses. It's like you're entering into a fight with somebody who on his terms, not on your own terms. In that sense. Of course, starts coming in when he starts writing with Kothari. That is where you can really critique him in that sense of, find problems with his philosophy and so on. So in Zizek says it. The Different Interpretation is a great book, but Deleuze and Kothari becomes a whole different beast. But given all of that stuff, that's why I said what we need to think about is that what is it in Hegel, and not only in Hegel, philosophy since Socrates down till Hegel, Deleuze is trying to resist. Deleuze is trying to resist some kind of a philosophical journey that West has had in some senses. What is it that he's resisting in it? That is, I think, the framing, at least to me. I personally don't see a way to counter Hegel, counter Deleuze through Hegel, through this form of, questioning where we ask the question, what can Hegel think that Deleuze cannot? I think that question is a question framed for a Deleuzian in some senses. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh no, I would just add that Hegel, I mean, I find Deleuze entirely internally consistent. That there's nothing really in Deleuze that necessarily does not work with itself to its own terms in its own way. In the same way that I find David Hume internally consistent relative to the world that he lived in and the lived experience, right? And I try to explain that in the paper. The issue becomes like what ends up happening is, say, David Hume overfits if you try to apply it to, say, globalized world, pluralism, and all these different things. He did not have to worry about that. And that's when you get Dugan, and trying to do Hume according to his terms leads to basically what we see happening today. And that's why, because I think it gets into sociology in the same way that Deleuze, I think, as an internally consistent system can absolutely work as a philosophy, say, on the individual level for the individual and different things like that. The question is, what are the social, for me, the questions become like the social ramifications of Deleuze, how that works when you're really emphasizing essential difference in non-relation, right? Does that hurt social bonds? I think it ultimately becomes like a question of the concrete, like the concrete reality of which one leads to versus the other. And that's almost like an empirical test, right? And that becomes kind of tricky And what does that look like? And how do we think? Zizek in Bodies Without Organs or whatever, Organs Without Bodies, wants to kind of say that Deleuze is postmodernity. Like he is the postmodern culture. One could accept that. One doesn't have to accept that, right? And then Zizek's going to be talking about a return to Hegel in different things. So I don't mean to say that like this is a question of how does Hegel one up Deleuze or not, because here's the issue. Relative to Deleuze's own system, I think you're 100% correct that is predicted. That's sort of bringing it in. The question becomes in the application of kind of lived experience and the formation of society and how people have communities and different things, which then is the Humean in me that wants to bring the test of the philosophy to the grounds of the common life and different things. Now, I do want to comment on the points you made where I think you're right, where Deleuze would say that Hegel doesn't actually think AB because he's stuck in representationalism. This seems to be the lurking, what I almost am starting to call the unknown, like kind of the big unknown of Hegel. And that is the relation of what I will, it seems like the structure of the notion and structure of nature. And it's almost like Hegel wants to suggest that the way that the notion unfolds to itself is identical to the way that nature unfolds to itself. So if you think the notion to itself, you are also thinking nature, or you are thinking, and that's the strange relation where in thinking A, you are also thinking B. And that is unveiled, or there is reason to think that by the very dialectical way that a notion to itself unfolds into otherness. Well, likewise, if you look at nature, there's kind of a dialectical way in which they obviously talks about the embryo becoming the human and the seed and different things. And there's like a part. So for him, there's a way in which to think the notion is also to think nature, because they share somehow an idealistic, like a structure. Now, that's where it gets very interesting, because is that a somehow analogous relationship, or is that a participatory relationship where the idea and the structure of the notion also participates somehow in the structure of nature, right? That's some crazy stuff, man, and I'm not really sure. And that's kind of the bizarre unknown territory, the science of logic that I'm thinking through. And what does actually Hegel think about that? I'm not sure, but on those grounds, it would be like that Hegel would be like, well, yes, to think the concept to itself is to think the notion to itself is also to think nature. So to think A is to think B. So you also are thinking B, that A entails B, but the question is that analogous? What is the speculative relationship between notion and nature? That is very curious to me. And I think for Deleuze, what he would say is that in order to think B, you have to think essential difference. You have to think of the fact that difference is always unfolding in a manner that unveils something new in that very unfolding, that there's always a B that lurks out in the A. And then it's just a question of the difference, I guess, of the unfolding. And that seems to be different, but I certainly don't want to be suggesting, and then I'll pass to whoever wants to speak. I certainly don't want to be suggesting that it's some sort of like, how do we get a one-up on Deleuze? I almost over the years have gotten to the place where I get tired of that, like, oh, Descartes was so stupid, oh, Kant was so stupid, or whatever. It's like, they were really smart. And I've kind of almost got more in this language of underfitting, overfitting, not right or wrong, or in this area it's good, or not this area, or so on and so on and so on. I mean, and also too, you could argue that a lot of the readings of Hegel today that are popular have to like disregard the philosophy of the right. You could argue that. There are parts that you disregard. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. So I do agree with you that that's not the right way to go about things. But let me give it to you, Chetan.
So my own reading on this is something of this nature that that Deleuze is pointing out the right problems in Hegel. There's no denying that. I don't think Deleuze's answers work. I don't think he's an adequate solution to those problems. For instance, just bringing in the virtual doesn't really solve the problem. It just poses it in a new way in many senses.
I think that puts it very well, because I'm very curious about the virtual. So, but please.
In many ways, it shouldn't. Deleuze shouldn't block us. And I read personally Deleuze to actually be able to think through Hegel in that sense, think through its limitations, its real limitations, its contradictions. But that work Deleuze has done brilliantly. There's no denying that. I personally think I don't find a good argument against that. That if you want to think through Hegel, in its very honest way, you should read Deleuze for that purposes. I don't think Deleuze himself can answer those questions. Deleuze's own answers might not be the most adequate to that. And that is where I think people like Zizek, and Zizek, that's why takes Deleuze very seriously also. If you read Zizek, Listen Nothing, and you read his interviews, he is putting up the same questions. If radical repetition is a problem for Deleuze, it's a problem for Zizek also. You can always see that if false movement is a problem for Deleuze, false movement is a problem for Zizek also. And Zizek, only difference is that Zizek is trying to take Hegel along with himself, and Deleuze is trying to leave Hegel behind in the same kind of problem matrix, in some senses. Representation is a problem for Deleuze. It's a problem for Zizek in a different way. So that's I think one of the ways to think through that question. That I don't think Deleuze's own answers to those questions in some senses.
Let me give it to Dimitri. Yeah, the other thing I wonder is like the development of the notion, precisely the failures of representation. It's almost like in Hegel, the very failures of representation is the development of the notion towards speculative reason. And so I wonder, although I agree that representation is a problem in Hegel, I guess I always took that was the problem that the notion realizes is a problem and is always reconstituting itself or re-seeing what it does because it cannot represent. And that, but then it's like, okay, but what does speculative reason do? Does it just represent anew? But then I guess that's the question of what is the relation of notion and nature? Does speculative reason somehow participate, or is it analogous? Because if it's analogous, then Deleuze is going to be like, see, you fall back into representation. But if it's somehow like deeper in a really weird and mysterious and strange participatory fashion, Hegel would be like, ha, it's not representative because it's somehow participatory. I'm not sure. Okay, Dimitri.
So, is logic nature? Well, two formulas that Hegel talks about a lot in his lectures on logic is that thought is being. Thought equates being. He also says logic equals metaphysics. Those are all different ways to say A equals B or spirit equals bone, and it's kind of what you're getting at with does logic equal nature. Now, in Sex and the Field Absolute, Zizek actually has a whole chapter devoted to quantum mechanics to see, like, okay, is there a homology? Is there at once a participation and analogy, as homology? Is that there? And he basically, it's quite funny what he does. He actually says in a note, his notes are so hilarious in that book, but he says in a note that, okay, I tried my best to understand all the formulas behind it, but now I'm just going off the general descriptions of these quantum physicists. And then he goes into goes into Niels Bohr and his whole idea with he has explained it in his jokes and lectures with like the hoof which hangs like this, so it brings bad luck. And well, basically I think the gesture itself is very interesting, right? Like this will to assert the homology between the symbolic order and I guess like the most the most like AB-esque scientific discoveries that we're coming up against. Now, I don't know. I guess Deleuze probably can think that if I trust all the points that Chetan's making, but perhaps the gesture would be different. Also, going off what Chetan said is that if you as some kind of Hegelian are asking the question, oh, but can Deleuze think this, or you're kind of saying in opposition to Deleuze, where you have this desire to affirm I guess Hegel's thought. Like, what is this gesture itself, and what's Deleuze doing about this gesture? I guess would be my next question to Chetan. Now, Mladen Dolar has a really, really great paper called Atom and the Void, And he talks about Hegel and Deleuze there in regards to Democritus and this ancient Greek word, which is then. And like there's miden and there's like different kinds of conjugations of this word. But then isn't really an existing word, yet it's used in ancient Greek philosophy with Democritus, which, you know, this word would translate to English as nothing, like nothing without the end, or in German it would be ichts, you know, and that's actually how like even German translators have translated this word since a very long time. So this less than nothing, I guess like another way to put another synonym for this would be like the indivisible division, or again, self-related negativity. This is basically what Hegel's philosophy can think, and it does so in a certain way with a certain kind of gesture where it affirms thought and being as an equation. Now, in this paper, Mladen Dolar also goes into what Deleuze wrote about this. So there's this I can't remember so much on the top of my head because it was a while ago I read this paper, and it's really mind-boggling. Anyway, for Deleuze, there is this kind of primary swerve to the very I guess actualization of a determination. And I wonder if we could translate this to be the very torsion I was talking about earlier, this idea of you know, like maybe a very simple and one-sided way to put this is like is like the swerve the ground of the self-related negativity, or is the self-related negativity the ground of this very swerve? I think something like this is something akin to what Mladen Dolar, he doesn't like just answer in a simplistic way, but kind of proposes like, okay, this is kind of where we go with this ancient Greek philosophy of the less than nothing with Hegel, and this is where Deleuze is going with this idea. So again, like massive questions and a lot of weeds in this territory. My question to you was that, you know, you said that there is a kind of setup in favor of Deleuzians that Hegelians can fall into when they frame their critique or their question for Deleuze in a certain way. Now, with Hegel, there is this equation of thought and being, and which Zizek, as a good Hegelian, actually goes forth with in his Sex and the Field Absolute, where he equates the symbolic order with the realm of quantum mechanics and says that, you know, we shouldn't be so fascinated with the substance of quantum mechanics and the amazing things that we're seeing there, but like actually we should be fascinated with the very subject at the heart of it, you know, which is the truth that it points us to. The subject is a self-related negativity. For Deleuze, you know, in this paper that Mladen Dolar writes about, the swerve seems to be necessary. So I wonder, how could you think of this in regards to different gestures, like philosophical gestures, or like maybe even subjective dispositions that differ in Hegel and Deleuze? You know, where you said, yeah, Hegelians can fall into a Deleuzian trap that you would recognize.
Yeah, Teddy, you want to say something? Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I'll just comment. It definitely seems as if, in order for Hegel not to fall into kind of for speculative reason to practically end up just a form of new representationalism, there's something, it does seem to be kind of quantum in the sense of the observer effect, the fact that how we think changes reality, and that there's some strange, and look, I mean, basically, does he not in the introduction kind of the Science of Locke be like, hey, we like to say that thought can't get to the thing of itself, but that assumes that thought is not somehow participating in the thing itself, right? Well, that's all a kind of quantum logic. Now, there's a lot of scientists in quantum mechanics that do not like the Copenhagen participation, and they want to be like, look, all we know now is a measurement problem. We can't be saying the ontology of quantums are somehow changed by thought itself, and they kind of push back about that. And that's a scientific question, right? And if one doesn't accept the Copenhagen interpretation, as I understand it, then that would suggest that this relation between nature and notion that might exist in Hegel as having some sort of participatory role is not there. And then the critiques of Deleuze are arguably more powerful, right? And then what you would have to do is say that Hegel must maintain, in order to avoid a problematic representationalism, it'd be like the bird in the hand, right? You know, the holding it this way versus this. It has to be an ever actively up. You have to very actively think constantly to keep that from occurring with new speculations. And the moment you stop, just like glancing over your shoulder to look at Lot's wife or something like that, or you look down and you look at the water, you sink, right? And so the critique of Deleuze, I think, would force Hegel to be incredibly active as a thinker, right? Like continually activity, which then, of course, would arguably overlay with Deleuze, because there's supposed to be an ever active creative evolution, creativity, unfolding of essential difference, of which is Bergson. So there'd be overlap there. So that was a thought. But anyway, let me give it to Chetan. And I fear I will have to go in a little bit. This has been, I really appreciate everyone getting lassoed into a technical debate conversation about differences of Deleuze and Hegel and all of those different things. And I've enjoyed it. I think this kind of conversation is quite valuable to work through different things. So I appreciate it. And I thank you for that. But let me give it to Chetan.
Thanks. So quickly sort of pointing, Dimitri, one of the easiest ways I think that comes to my mind is if you read, say, Dall-E, you read Zupančič, you read Zizek even, they would say, they would say this about Deleuze in that sense. They would never argue against Deleuze. What would they say is that where Deleuze sees the failure of Hegel, they would precisely see the success over there. The normal line that they would use in that sense is, I think it's a common line which you would have read many times, that, you know, that Deleuze solves the problem in a very Hegelian way. It's more Hegelian than Hegel himself could have been. So it's like Hegel could not think something very Hegelian in his own right thinking, but Deleuze could think. That is how they would usually put that. And there's a reason why they're using these kind of language over there, because they also see that the problem is very tricky in that sense, because Deleuze exactly becomes Hegelian at the point at which he tries to solve that, you know, kind of a question in that sense, and which is why they are not trying to oppose Deleuze and Hegel in that sense. The other thing is that when we look at Deleuze's critique of Hegel, we need to look at the question of aesthetic ideal in Nietzsche. I think that's the core of this problem at some level. So to put it very simply, in Hinduism, we have these two ways of sort of reaching God in some senses. One is what you call the Tantra. The other is what you call the Vedanta in that sense. It's basically unity in some senses. So one happens through you leave sex, you leave drinking, you leave, you know, you become ascetic in that sense. The other is that you indulge in sex, you indulge in alcohol, you indulge in, you know, and you reach from, there are these two modes of, in some senses, doing things. Hegel, Deleuze, taking from Nietzsche, sees in Hegel the ascetic side. The side which is asking you to, in some senses, you know, leave those. It's interesting that Deleuze's argument against Hegel is not conceptual argument, which is why. Conceptually, he agrees with Hegel in every point. Conceptually, Deleuze agrees with Hegel. He says that Deleuze has a false movement. That means there is a real movement which he has. You know, he has a false, that means there is a real dialectic that he has. You can always play that game with Deleuze. Deleuze conceptually agrees with Hegel in its broadest sense. Where Deleuze sort of gets into a problem with Hegel as such is that he says that Deleuze is operationalizing those categories in bad conscience, in reactive forces, in resentiment, in aesthetic ideals, you know, so on and so forth. Will to nothingness. But it's very interesting that today, if you look at your American university culture, they are exactly using Deleuze in bad conscience. There is something over there. For instance, when I look at my friends who are doing the PhDs in US, invariably what you have is a Deleuzean interpretation to back what you would quote unquote call the woke culture. You know, in fact, they would find Deleuze not Deleuzean enough over there. And they would go to other thinkers to argue that you know, that there has to be some kind of a moral backing towards these idealistic claims. Claims, they need certain kind of power equalizing things. If you look at the American university culture today, so whether it's a question of race, whether it's a question of gender, all of these questions are coming into attack precisely using Deleuze or the Deleuzian and even the Derridian. And I know a lot of university professors who have read Deleuze, who are engaging with that, do not know which way to turn now, because money and grants are coming from that side. Let's be honest, today, if you have a good gender, your grants come from there, and many Deleuzians are getting the grants from that space. But they know Deleuze himself doesn't really, So I don't think Deleuze himself actually could think the problem through. If his problem was bad conscience in Hegel, there is very little to be said when Deleuze himself can be operationalized in that manner. And that means that reactive forces, at least in Nietzsche, are not a consequence of a conceptual apparatus. They are a consequence of any conceptual apparatus being overused. If you use a conceptual apparatus again and again, it becomes reactive. And Deleuze understood that. If you read his, it's not that he didn't see through this problem. Any conceptual apparatus, if you use it again and again, becomes reactive. That is where you have to find a new way of saying the same thing. Wittgenstein got it right to that degree, and which is why I think this simple opposition between Deleuze and Hegel, what Deleuze is trying to set up, is a failure. If the condition of the opposition is this question of the aesthetic ideal, bad conscience, resentiment, will to nothingness, whatever it is, if that opposition was set to simply show, this movement, it was a failure because any conceptual apparatus can fit into the same paradox. And Deleuze's own conceptual apparatus has been fit into that paradox today, into that same forces today. So then how do you, find a way forward from there?
No, I think that was very lovely put. I appreciate that very much. And again, like I said, I think it's just really important to get to the place where kind of out of the business of saying, oh, Descartes was an idiot, oh, Leibniz was an idiot. Like, it's quite clear that obviously Deleuze is a hyper genius. And the question is simply, and it's also interesting because I do think it's the problem of internally consistent systems. Well, I think Deleuze is internally consistent, but it's the issue of that internally consistent system can be applied in certain ways that leads to, say, some of the problems that you see in wokeism or different things. You would say, well, that's a misinterpretation. That's not the right way that Deleuze will take it. And I know that Justin Murphy has a book based Deleuze where he wants to argue there's a very conservative take on Deleuze that's very anti-woke and different things like that. And so certainly it always depends on the angles that one takes on these things. And I definitely think that in the conversation, one has to incorporate, like you say, Deleuze. And I always do find it interesting that so many other thinkers like Zupantre, etc., don't say Deleuze is wrong. They say that Deleuze is kind of Hegelian without knowing it, which is always kind of a funny thing, right? Oh, he's Hegelian without knowing it, which then would mean that that's part of the conversation because he's thinking things that Hegel could not think or did not think at his time and ends up doing it in a Hegelian way and thus can be incorporated into the conversation. That seems correct to me. And again, in the same way that I've had to come to conclude that Hume is overfitting if you try to take how I interpret him and apply it on certain issues of the political economy of the day. The issue is where Deleuze, to me, ends up if you do that. But then you can say, then the question is, can Hegel make a difference? Or is there different thinking that has to be taken into account? For me, I ultimately do end up a lot in the topics of like beauty, aesthetic philosophy, and the philosophy of glimmers and different things. So I think you have to go in that direction. And you also have to have transformations in economics and a lot of other things. So I don't know if Hegel provides an answer to the pricing problem of horizons, as I like to put it. And I'm not sure if that Hegel can necessarily get into some of the ways that nation states would relate or have to define themselves. However, if indeed we do, for me, what's interesting is the possibility of a justification of an A-B logic and how that, as a foundational text, transforms how thinking can develop. And as I hope in the Hume to Hegel paper explains why I think that's important, because of difference. Well, if otherness is essential, which is a kind of essential difference, but it's one that makes otherness essential in a relation, that seems to be really necessary for us to think in a manner that does not end up in tribalism. But the thing, and again, I hate to run. I've really enjoyed this. I'm extremely interested in virtuality in Deleuze, like the function of the virtual, and trying to really get a hold on why that is just, and trying to articulate well why that is just a re-articulation of the problem in a different way. And if a virtual space simply doesn't have the same imperative to the subject as does taking relations as perhaps of a different ontological calibration or substance. But I'll have to think on that. Anyway, I appreciate you all letting me pull you into this discussion. I've enjoyed it. Chetan, I'm so glad that we could go through the joys of Deleuze. This has been a blast. Dimitri, thank you for jumping in. I've enjoyed it. So thank you very much. This has been a real treat.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Goodbye. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you all. Dimitri, thank you, sir. Y'all have a good one. Appreciate it very much.